You're making the biggest mistake of your life, my stepmother shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my arm as I stood in our mansion's marble foyer. Marcus Chen just proposed to you and you said no. Do you have any idea who his family is? I gently pulled my arm away, meeting her furious gaze with a calm I'd never possessed in my previous life. I know exactly who he is, Patricia. That's why I'm saying no. My stepsister Vivian laughed cruelly from the grand staircase, her designer heels clicking as she descended. Oh, please, Elena, you think you're too good for the Chen heir? He's worth $3 billion. His family owns half the city's real estate. And he's gorgeous, Patricia added, her voice dripping with disbelief. Every girl in the city would kill to marry Marcus Chen. But you ungrateful little fool, you turn him down? Behind them, I could see Marcus himself standing in our parlor, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. His dark eyes met mine through the doorway, and I saw something there that my family couldn't see. Something that had cost me everything in my first life. The cold calculation of a predator who'd just been denied his prey. I don't love him, I said simply, the words that would have terrified me 25 years ago now, flowing easily from my lips. Vivian's laughter turned hysterical. Love? Love? Elena, you work at a coffee shop. You barely graduated from community college. You live in our basement. And you're turning down Marcus Chen because you don't love him? My father, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His face was red with embarrassment and rage. Elena, I'm telling you as your father, you will call Marcus right now and tell him you've changed your mind. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. The opportunity to what, Dad? I asked quietly. To become his trophy wife? To smile pretty while he provides for you. Patricia cut me off. While he elevates this entire family, do you think his connections won't benefit all of us? Your sister's modeling career, your father's business deals, my social standing. You're being selfish beyond belief. But I knew what they didn't know. I knew what Marcus Chen would do to me in 6 months. I knew about the photos he'd take without my consent, the way he'd control every aspect of my life, and how, when I finally tried to leave him, he'd destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I'd lose everything. I knew because I'd lived it all before. In my previous life, I'd said yes to that proposal. I'd been so grateful, so overwhelmed by the idea that someone like Marcus could want someone like me. My family had celebrated like they'd won the lottery, treating me better in those engagement months than they had in years. I'd thought it was love. I'd been so wrong. I'm not changing my mind, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting around me. Then you're no longer welcome in this house, my father declared, his voice cold and final. If you're going to throw away the best thing that's ever happened to this family, you can do it somewhere else. I nodded calmly, even as my heart broke. Not for the loss of my family's support, which had always been conditional anyway, but for the girl I used to be. The girl who would have crumbled under this pressure, who would have begged for their forgiveness and called Marcus immediately. I understand, I said. I'll pack my things. As I walked toward the basement stairs, I could hear them behind me. Patricia calling me an idiot. Vivian saying she'd always known I was unstable. My father muttering about ungrateful children. And underneath it all, the low murmur of Marcus's voice as he spoke to them in soothing tones, playing the part of the wounded but gracious suitor. But I had advantages they couldn't imagine. I had 25 years of memories they didn't know about. I knew exactly what was coming, and this time I was going to be ready. The memories of my first life hit me like a tidal wave as I sat in my basement room, surrounded by the few belongings I could call my own. I remembered dying. The heart attack at 51, alone in a hospital bed, my body worn down by years of stress and abuse. I remembered the overwhelming regret, the knowledge that I'd wasted my entire life trying to please people who would never love me. When I'd opened my eyes again, I was 26, lying in this same basement room the day before Marcus Chen would walk into the coffee shop where I worked. At first, I'd thought it was just a vivid dream, a cruel trick of my dying brain. But as the days passed, everything unfolded exactly as I remembered. Every conversation, every news headline, every family dinner, all of it identical to my previous life. The abuse had started when I was 7, just after my mother died in a car accident. My father had remarried within a year, desperate for a mother figure for his daughter and someone to manage his household. Patricia had arrived like a whirlwind, bringing with her 11-year-old Vivian and a determination to reshape our family to her exact specifications. I was the reminder of his first wife, the child who looked too much like the woman he'd supposedly loved. Patricia had made it clear from day one that I was an inconvenience, a burden to be tolerated rather than a daughter to be cherished. She'd convinced my father that I was difficult, ungrateful, and possibly mentally unstable, a narrative that became easier to believe as I grew increasingly withdrawn and defensive. Vivian had been the golden child from the beginning, beautiful, talented, ambitious, everything Patricia wanted in a daughter and everything I apparently wasn't. They'd spent thousands on her modeling classes, headshots, and designer clothes, while I'd worn thrift store finds and worked part-time jobs from the age of 14 just to buy my own school supplies. The emotional abuse had been constant and insidious. I was too fat, too thin, too quiet, too loud, too smart for my own good, too stupid to succeed. My grades didn't matter because I'd probably just get pregnant and drop out anyway. My dreams of college were unrealistic because who would pay for someone like me to get an education? My opinions didn't matter because I was just a child, and then later because I was just a failure who lived in their basement. When I'd graduated high school, I'd begged to go to the state university. I'd even gotten a partial scholarship, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. My father had refused to co-sign for loans, saying it was a waste of money to educate a girl who would just get married anyway. Patricia had suggested I learn a trade instead, something practical like hairdressing or restaurant work. I'd compromised, enrolling in community college and working full-time to pay my way. It had taken me 6 years to get my associate degree in business, 6 years of 18-hour days and exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. My family had made it clear that I was pathetic for taking so long, for setting my sights so low, for still living at home at 25. In my first life, when Marcus Chen had walked into that coffee shop, I'd been so beaten down that I genuinely believed I was lucky he'd noticed me. A billionaire's son, beautiful and charming, interested in a nobody like me. It had seemed like a fairy tale, but fairy tales, I'd learned too late, often had very dark original versions. Marcus had been everything a woman could want in the beginning. Attentive, generous, romantic. He'd showered me with expensive gifts and taken me to places I'd only dreamed of. He'd told me I was beautiful, special, different from all the other women he'd known. He'd made me feel like I mattered for the first time in my life. The proposal had come after 6 months of whirlwind romance. My family had been overjoyed. Finally, I was worth something to them. Finally, I could contribute to the family's status and wealth. Patricia had actually hugged me, tears in her eyes as she'd told me how proud she was. My father had shaken Marcus's hand with genuine warmth, already talking about business opportunities and golf games. The engagement had lasted another 6 months, during which I'd been the perfect future wife. Agreeable, grateful, eager to please. I'd let Marcus make all our decisions, from where we lived to what I wore to who we socialized with. I'd thought I was being a good partner, showing him how much I appreciated everything he was giving me. I'd been so naive. The wedding had been spectacular, everything I'd dreamed of, and nothing I'd actually wanted. Patricia had taken over the planning, insisting on the biggest, most expensive celebration possible. It was the social event of the year with 1,000 guests, most of whom I'd never met. I'd felt like a prop in my own wedding, a pretty doll dressed up for other people's entertainment. The mask had started slipping during our honeymoon in Paris. Small things at first. Marcus getting angry when I wanted to visit a museum instead of going shopping. The way he'd grab my wrist just a little too tightly when he thought I was taking too long to respond to his questions. The photos he'd taken of me sleeping without asking permission. Back home, the control had escalated quickly. He'd convinced me to quit my job, saying his wife shouldn't need to work. He'd chosen our social circle, isolating me from the few friends I'd had. He'd monitored my spending, my phone calls, my internet usage. He'd told me it was because he loved me so much, because he wanted to protect me from people who might try to take advantage of our wealth. The physical abuse had started small too. A push here, a grab there, always followed by immediate apologies and expensive gifts. He'd never hit me in the face. Nothing that couldn't be covered by makeup or explained away as clumsiness. I'd made excuses for him, convinced myself that the stress of his business was making him act out of character. But the worst part had been the photos and videos. Marcus had been obsessed with documenting our intimate moments, often without my knowledge or consent. He'd called it romantic, his way of preserving our memories. When I'd tried to object, he'd become cold and cruel, telling me that a wife shouldn't have secrets from her husband, that my modesty was really just selfishness. I'd stayed for 15 years, becoming smaller and quieter with each passing day. I'd had no friends, no job, no money of my own. I'd signed prenups that left me with almost nothing if I left. My family had made it clear that if the marriage failed, it would be my fault for not being grateful enough, not trying hard enough, not appreciating what I had. When Marcus had started bringing other women to our house, I'd finally found the courage to ask for a divorce. That's when I discovered the full extent of his cruelty. The photos and videos he'd taken over the years weren't just for his private collection, they were insurance policies. He'd told me that if I tried to leave him, if I tried to take any of his money or damage his reputation, he'd release everything. He'd destroy me so completely that I'd never be able to show my face in public again. But I'd been too desperate to care. I'd contacted a lawyer anyway, started divorce proceedings despite his threats. That's when Marcus had made good on his promises. The photos and videos had appeared everywhere, social media, email chains, even projected onto buildings downtown. But worse than the humiliation had been the way he'd edited them, made it look like I'd been cheating on him with multiple partners, like I'd been the abuser in our relationship. He'd painted himself as the victim of a mentally unstable, unfaithful wife who was trying to extort money from him. My family had believed his version immediately. Patricia had called me a disgrace, my father had refused to speak to me, and Vivian had publicly disowned me on her social media platforms. The entire city had turned against me. I'd lost the divorce case, left with nothing but debt and a reputation so destroyed that I couldn't even get a job at a gas station. I'd spent the last 10 years of my first life homeless, addicted to drugs, and completely broken. The girl who'd once dreamed of college and career had died somewhere in that mansion, replaced by a ghost who just wanted the pain to stop. The heart attack had been almost a relief. But now I was back, and I knew exactly what Marcus Chen really was underneath his charming exterior. I knew about the insider trading that would bring down his father's company in 8 months. I knew about the money laundering operation they ran through their charity foundation. I knew about the bribes, the blackmail, the federal investigation that was already underway but wouldn't become public for another year. Most importantly, I knew that in 14 months, Marcus Chen would be arrested on 47 federal charges. He'd spend the next 30 years in prison, his family's empire would crumble, and everyone who'd mocked me for rejecting him would finally understand that I'd made the smartest decision of my life. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for justice to find him. This time, I was going to make sure he got exactly what he deserved, and I was going to protect other women from suffering the way I had. This time, I was going to fight back. The decision crystallized in my mind as I lay in that basement room, listening to my family celebrate my departure upstairs. I could hear the clink of champagne glasses, the sound of Marcus's laughter, Patricia's relieved voice talking about dodging a bullet by getting me out of their lives before I could cause more embarrassment. They thought I was broken. They thought I was weak. They thought I was the same naive girl who'd spent 26 years begging for their approval. They were wrong. I'd spent my first life being reactive, letting things happen to me instead of taking control. This time would be different. This time, I had the most powerful weapon in the world, information. I knew exactly what was going to happen and when, and I was going to use that knowledge to orchestrate Marcus's downfall while building my own empire. But I needed to be smart about it. I couldn't just call the FBI and claim to have information about crimes that hadn't been discovered yet. They'd think I was unstable or involved. I needed to guide the investigation naturally, provide them with breadcrumbs that would lead them to the evidence they needed. First, I needed to disappear from my family's radar completely. Let them think I'd slunk away in shame, maybe left town to avoid the embarrassment. While they celebrated their escape from my craziness, I'd be building the foundation for their destruction. I started by moving out that very night, taking only what I could carry in 2 suitcases. I'd been saving money from my coffee shop job for years, keeping it in a separate account that my family didn't know about. It wasn't much, maybe $3,000, but it would be enough to get me started. I found a tiny studio apartment across town, the kind of place my family would never think to look for me. It was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette that was older than I was. But it was mine, truly mine, for the first time in my life. Next, I quit my job at the coffee shop and enrolled in online courses for digital marketing and web design. In my first life, I'd always been good with computers, but I'd never had the chance to develop those skills. This time, I was going to become an expert in digital forensics, social media management, and online reputation building. While I was learning, I started documenting everything I could remember about Marcus and his family's criminal activities. I created encrypted files with dates, locations, names, everything I could recall from news reports, trial transcripts, and federal indictments that wouldn't happen for another year. I organized it all into a timeline that would allow me to feed information to the authorities at exactly the right moments. But most importantly, I started watching Marcus. I created fake social media accounts with stolen photos and elaborate backstories. I joined the exclusive clubs where he socialized, the charity boards where he networked, the business forums where he conducted his illegal deals. I became invisible, just another face in the crowd of people trying to get close to his wealth and power. What I saw confirmed everything I remembered and more. Marcus Chen wasn't just a criminal. He was a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable women. During the time he'd been pursuing me in my first life, he'd also been involved with at least 3 other women. All of them were like I'd been, isolated, financially struggling, desperate for validation and love. I watched him operate with the same patterns every time. The initial charm offensive, the expensive gifts, the promises of security and happiness. Then the gradual isolation, the controlling behavior, the emotional manipulation. I saw him taking photos without consent, recording conversations, building dossiers of compromising material on every woman he targeted. But this time, I was watching him too. I documented everything. Every illegal meeting, every bribe, every woman he manipulated. I built comprehensive files on his associates, his business partners, his enablers. I tracked money transfers, recorded phone conversations from public spaces, and photographed meetings that the FBI would later need as evidence. Most satisfying of all, I started sabotaging his new relationships. When he'd target a vulnerable woman, I'd find ways to warn her. Anonymous emails with just enough information to make her suspicious. Social media messages from fake accounts, connecting her with other survivors who could share their stories. Mysterious phone calls that interrupted his romantic dinners, forcing him to leave at crucial moments. I couldn't save all of them. Marcus was too skilled, too charming, too wealthy for some women to resist. But I saved enough to start building a network of survivors who would be crucial witnesses when the time came. The breakthrough came 6 months after I'd rejected his proposal. I was monitoring one of his business meetings at an upscale restaurant when I overheard him discussing the charity money laundering operation with his father's chief financial officer. They were planning to move $10 million through their foundation to accounts in the Cayman Islands, money that was supposed to be going to children's hospitals. This was my moment. I followed the CFO home and discovered he lived in my old neighborhood, just 3 blocks from my family's mansion. More importantly, he had a habit of working late in his home office with the windows open, apparently confident that his conversations were private. That night, I positioned myself in the garden behind his house with a high-quality audio recorder I'd purchased online. For 3 hours, I documented phone conversations that detailed the entire money laundering operation, including account numbers, transfer dates, and the names of everyone involved. But I didn't go to the FBI yet. Instead, I created an anonymous blog called Whistleblower Truth and began posting carefully redacted information about corruption in the city's elite circles. I never mentioned names directly, but I provided enough details for investigative journalists to follow the breadcrumbs. The blog took off faster than I'd imagined. Within weeks, I had thousands of readers, many of them sharing their own stories about corruption and abuse among the city's wealthy families. I'd created a community of people who'd been silenced for years, finally finding their voices. Local news stations started picking up my stories, investigating the leads I'd provided. I fed them information gradually, always staying just ahead of their investigations, guiding them toward the evidence they needed without revealing how I knew so much. Meanwhile, my family was starting to realize that rejecting Marcus Chen hadn't been the disaster they'd predicted. The first cracks appeared when Vivian's modeling career suddenly stalled. The agencies that had been interested in her before, agencies that had connections to Marcus's business network, were no longer returning her calls. "It's so strange," I heard Patricia telling her friend during one of my surveillance visits to their neighborhood. "Ever since that whole mess with Elena, opportunities have been drying up. You don't think Marcus is holding a grudge, do you?" She was closer to the truth than she knew. Marcus Chen was absolutely holding a grudge, not just against me, but against my entire family. In his mind, they'd failed to control me, failed to deliver the compliant wife he'd expected. In my first life, he'd been grateful for their support and had rewarded them accordingly. This time, their association with the woman who'd publicly rejected him was becoming a liability. I watched with grim satisfaction as their invitations to exclusive events stopped coming. As my father's business deals mysteriously fell through at the last minute. As Patricia's social standing began to slip when other wealthy wives started treating her with cool politeness instead of warm friendship. They still blamed me, of course. In their minds, my selfishness was continuing to damage their lives, even after I'd left. But I could see the doubt creeping in. The first hint that maybe, just maybe, they'd backed the wrong horse. The doubt became certainty 8 months after my rejection, when Marcus's business empire began to crumble in exactly the way I remembered. The federal investigation became public on a Tuesday morning in March, splashed across the front page of every newspaper in the city. "Billionaire family under federal investigation for money laundering, fraud, and corruption," the headlines screamed, accompanied by photos of FBI agents carrying boxes out of the Chen family's corporate headquarters. I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the building where I used to work, watching the news coverage on my laptop while sipping a latte that cost more than I used to make in an hour. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Elena, it's Vivian. Please call me. It's important." I ignored it and ordered another latte. The news coverage was even more comprehensive than I'd remembered from my first life. This time, I'd made sure the journalists had access to more evidence, more witnesses, more documentation of the Chen family's crimes. The anonymous tips I'd been providing for months had created a web of investigations that were all coming together at once. Marcus's charity foundation was being audited by 3 separate government agencies. His business partners were distancing themselves as quickly as possible. Most satisfying of all, the women I'd helped escape his manipulation were coming forward as witnesses, telling their stories to federal investigators and supportive journalists. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from my father. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 3 minutes of stammering, awkward attempts at reconciliation. He'd been thinking a lot about our last conversation. He might have been too hasty in his reaction to my decision. Perhaps we could sit down and talk like adults about what had happened. I deleted it without finishing it. Patricia's call came an hour later, and this one I did answer, curious to hear what my stepmother had to say now that her golden boy was facing federal charges. "Elena, sweetheart," she began, her voice sickeningly sweet, in a way it had never been when she actually considered me family. "I hope you're doing well. I've been so worried about you." "Have you?" I asked mildly. "Of course. I know we had our differences about that Marcus situation, but I want you to know that I never stopped caring about you. You're family, and family sticks together during a difficult times." I almost laughed. "Are you having a difficult time, Patricia?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, some of the sweetness had curdled. "Well, yes. All this business with Marcus has been very disturbing. The news reports are just terrible. I can't imagine what those poor investigators are going through, having to wade through all those lies and fabrications." "You think the charges are fabricated?" "Of course they are," she snapped, dropping the pretense entirely. "Marcus is a good man from a respectable family. This is obviously some kind of political hit job, or maybe corporate espionage from his competitors. You know how these billionaires operate. They'll destroy each other for market share. Hmm, I said noncommittally. The point is, Patricia continued, I think we all owe you an apology. You showed remarkable intuition in staying away from all this drama. Very mature, very wise. Now I did laugh, a sound that clearly unsettled her because she rushed to continue talking. Your father and I have been discussing it, and we think you should come home. Put all this unpleasantness behind us. We miss you, Elena. The house feels empty without you. Does it? I asked. I seem to remember you celebrating when I left. That was just emotions running high. You know how your father gets when he's stressed about business. And I was worried about you making such a big decision so quickly. But now I can see that you were protecting yourself, and I respect that. The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. But then again, it had worked on me for 20 years in my first life. That's very kind of you to say, Patricia, but I'm quite happy where I am. Where are you? The question came out too quickly, too eager. We tried to find you to make sure you were okay, but I'm safe, I said simply. I'm happy. I'm exactly where I need to be. But Elena, surely you understand that this situation with Marcus changes everything. The family needs to present a united front during this difficult time. People are asking questions about our connection to him, and it would be better if we could show that we're all together, that we support each other no matter what. There it was, the real reason for the call. My family's social standing was crumbling along with Marcus's empire, and they needed me back as proof that they'd been smart enough to see through him all along. I think you're right that this situation changes everything, I agreed, but not in the way you think. What do you mean? I stood up from my table and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where the Chen family's corporate logo was being removed from the tallest building downtown. I mean that for the first time in my life, I'm seeing exactly who everyone really is, including my family. Elena, don't be dramatic. We're trying to make things right here. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to use me to save face. You spent years telling me I was worthless, ungrateful, and stupid. You disowned me for making a choice that you said would ruin the family. And now that I've been proven right, you want me to come home so you can pretend you supported me all along. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, Patricia spoke again, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I don't know what's gotten into you, Elena, but this attitude is very unbecoming. After everything your father and I have done for you, this is how you repay us, with spite and resentment? What exactly have you done for me, Patricia? We gave you a home. We fed you, clothed you, educated you. You gave me a basement room and told me I should be grateful for it. You fed me leftovers and hand-me-downs while Vivian got everything new. You convinced my father to refuse to help pay for college, then spent the money you saved on Vivian's modeling classes. What else? We treated you like our own daughter. No, I said quietly. You treated me like an unwanted burden that you were stuck with. And the moment I made a choice you didn't like, you threw me away without a second thought. So please don't pretend this is about love or family or caring about my well-being. This is about damage control, and we both know it. I could hear her breathing heavily through the phone, and I knew she was fighting the urge to scream at me the way she had when I was a child. Fine, she said finally, her voice ice cold. If that's how you want to be. But don't come crawling back to us when you realize what you've thrown away. Don't expect us to be here when you finally grow up and understand how the world really works. I won't, I promised her. I understand exactly how the world works now, and I understand exactly who you are. I hung up before she could respond and immediately blocked her number. My phone buzzed again almost immediately, Vivian calling from a different number. Then my father, then Patricia from what was probably a friend's phone. I blocked them all and turned off my phone entirely. Walking back to my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. In my first life, that conversation would have destroyed me. I would have apologized, begged for forgiveness, agreed to come home just to stop the conflict. I would have convinced myself that I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful, but this time I knew the truth. They hadn't called because they missed me or loved me or wanted what was best for me. They'd called because Marcus Chen's arrest had exposed their judgment as catastrophically wrong, and they needed me to help them save face. Let them scramble. Let them panic as their social circle turned against them, as their business opportunities dried up, as their carefully constructed image crumbled. They'd made their choices, and now they could live with the consequences. I had more important things to focus on, like making sure Marcus Chen never had the chance to hurt another woman the way he'd hurt me. The trial was still 8 months away, but I was already preparing for the final phase of my plan. The phase where I would step out of the shadows and claim credit for bringing down the most dangerous predator in the city. The phase where everyone would finally understand that the pathetic, grateful girl they'd known was gone forever. Marcus Chen's perp walk was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more. I stood in the crowd of reporters and onlookers outside the federal courthouse, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, just another face in the sea of people who'd come to witness the fall of a dynasty. But unlike everyone else, I wasn't there for the spectacle. I was there to see justice finally being served. He looked smaller than I remembered, somehow diminished by the handcuffs and the orange jumpsuit. Gone was the commanding presence that had once made me feel so lucky to have his attention. In its place was a broken man who'd finally been forced to face the consequences of his actions. The federal prosecutor had done her job well. 47 charges spanning everything from money laundering to racketeering to sexual exploitation. The evidence was overwhelming, built from the foundation I'd carefully laid over the past 18 months. Anonymous tips, survivor testimonies, financial records that had been discovered by investigative journalists who'd followed the breadcrumbs I'd scattered. But the most damning evidence had come from an unexpected source: Marcus himself. 6 months into the investigation, he'd grown paranoid and desperate. He'd started making mistakes, trying to intimidate witnesses, attempting to destroy evidence, even bribing federal agents. All of it captured on surveillance video, recorded phone calls, and digital communications that made his guilt undeniable. In my first life, he'd been too smart to fall into those traps. But this time, I'd been pushing him toward them, creating pressure from multiple directions that forced him into increasingly reckless behavior. The crowd cheered as he was led into the courthouse, and I felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost spiritual. This man had destroyed my first life, had broken me so completely that I'd died alone and forgotten. But in the end, I'd gotten the last word. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I know what you did." I frowned, checking the message again. It was from a burner phone number, no other identifying information. My first instinct was paranoia. Had someone discovered my role in Marcus's downfall? But as I thought about it, I realized it could be anyone. Dozens of people had been involved in bringing down the Chen family empire, and plenty of them had reasons to stay anonymous. I deleted the message and headed home to my apartment, which had grown considerably nicer over the past year. My digital marketing business was thriving, built on skills I'd developed specifically to destroy Marcus, but profitable enough to give me real financial independence for the first time in my life. More importantly, I'd been documenting everything for a book deal that was going to make me rich and famous. The Girl Who Brought Down a Billionaire, a survivor's story of justice and revenge. Publishers had been circling ever since word leaked that there was a mysterious tipster who'd helped build the case against Marcus Chen. They had no idea that tipster was the same pathetic girl who'd lived in her family's basement, the nobody who'd somehow been smart enough to reject the city's most eligible bachelor just months before his arrest. I was still savoring that irony when I got home and found someone waiting outside my apartment building. It was Detective Sarah Martinez, the federal investigator who'd been leading the Chen case. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, the kind of person who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "Miss Rivera," she said as I approached the building entrance, "I was hoping we could talk." "About what?" I asked, though my pulse was already accelerating. "About Marcus Chen, and about how you knew to reject his proposal 18 months before we arrested him." My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come on, Elena. Can I call you Elena?" She stepped closer, her voice friendly but with an edge that made it clear this wasn't really a request. "We've been investigating this case for 2 years. We know everything about Chen's operation, his victims, his methods, and we know that somehow you were the only woman who saw through him immediately." "Maybe I was just lucky," I said carefully. Lucky. She nodded thoughtfully. That's what your family said too. When we interviewed them as part of our background investigation, they all said the same thing, that you'd gotten lucky by rejecting him, that you'd shown surprising intuition in avoiding such a dangerous man. I unlocked the building door, hoping she'd take the hint that this conversation was over. Instead, she followed me inside. The thing is, Detective Martinez continued as we climbed the stairs to my floor, luck doesn't explain some of the other interesting coincidences we've uncovered, like how several of Chen's potential victims received anonymous warnings right before he was about to escalate his abuse, or how key evidence in our case was discovered by journalists who'd received tips from untraceable sources, or how Chen started making the mistakes that ultimately brought him down right after you rejected him. I stopped at my apartment door, key in hand. I think you're giving me too much credit. Am I? Because here's what I think happened. She leaned against the wall, settling in like she had all the time in the world. I think you knew exactly who Marcus Chen was when he proposed to you. I think you not only rejected him, but started a campaign to bring him down. And I think you're the anonymous source who's been feeding information to journalists and investigators for the past year and a half. The smart thing would have been to deny everything, to act confused and offended by her accusations. But looking at Detective Martinez, I could see that she already knew. The only question was whether she could prove it. Hypothetically, I said slowly, if someone had information about a dangerous criminal, wouldn't you want them to share it with law enforcement? She smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. Hypothetically, yes. But I'd also want to understand how they got that information and why they chose to share it the way they did. I unlocked my apartment and gestured for her to come inside. If this conversation was happening, it might as well happen somewhere I felt comfortable. What do you want from me, detective? The truth, she said simply, taking a seat on my couch. And maybe some help with a few loose ends in our case. I poured myself a glass of wine, offering her one which she declined. Then I sat across from her and made a decision that would change everything. What if I told you that Marcus Chen had done this before? That he'd destroyed other women, other families in ways that never made it into your investigation? Her eyes sharpened with interest. I'd say that sounds like information that could be very valuable to federal prosecutors. And what if I told you that I had evidence of those crimes? Documentation, recordings, witness statements, everything you'd need to add more charges to his indictment. I'd say that would make you a very important witness, the kind of witness who gets protection, consideration, and recognition for their cooperation with federal law enforcement. I took a sip of my wine, considering. In my first life, I'd been a victim who'd never gotten justice. But this time, I had the chance to be the hero of the story, the woman who'd brought down a monster and saved countless others from his cruelty. There's something else, I said finally. Something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out. Detective Martinez leaned forward, every muscle in her body focused on what I was about to say. I knew Marcus Chen would be arrested because I've lived through this before. All of it. I died 25 years in the future, and somehow I came back to this moment with all my memories intact. I rejected him because I knew exactly what he would do to me if I said yes. The silence stretched between us for a long moment. Then Detective Martinez did something I hadn't expected. She laughed. Elena, I've been a federal investigator for 15 years. I've heard every story, every excuse, every explanation you can imagine. But I've never heard anyone claim to be a time traveler. I know how it sounds, I said. But it's the truth. I can prove it. How? I walked to my desk and pulled out a thick folder I'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Because I know things about Marcus Chen's operation that haven't been discovered yet. Things that won't be found for another 6 months, when your investigation expands to include his overseas accounts. I know about the property in Switzerland where he kept his most damaging blackmail material. I know about the judge he was bribing in family court. I know about the senator who's been taking payments to block regulatory oversight of his industry. Detective Martinez's expression grew more serious as I handed her the folder. She opened it and began reading, her eyes widening as she took in the meticulously detailed information I'd compiled. This is... She started, then stopped, flipping through page after page of dates, names, account numbers, and criminal activities. If even half of this is accurate, it would triple the scope of our investigation. It's all accurate, I told her. Every single detail. Because I lived through the consequences of not stopping him the first time. She closed the folder and looked at me with new eyes. Not the suspicious law enforcement officer who'd been testing me, but the investigator who'd just been handed the key to the biggest case of her career. Elena, I don't know if you're psychic, if you have some kind of inside information, or if you really are a time traveler. But what I do know is that you've just given me enough evidence to put Marcus Chen away for the rest of his life. Good, I said simply. That's all I ever wanted. The second trial was even more spectacular than the first. By the time Detective Martinez and her team had followed up on all the information I'd provided, Marcus Chen was facing an additional 93 federal charges. The case had expanded to include 12 co-conspirators, including a federal judge and 2 senators. It was being called the corruption trial of the century, and I was the star witness. The media had dubbed me the woman who knew, painting me as a mysterious figure who'd somehow seen through Marcus Chen's facade when everyone else had been fooled. Publishers were in a bidding war for my book rights. Movie studios were calling about adaptation rights. I'd gone from being a nobody who lived in a basement to being one of the most famous women in America. But the best part wasn't the fame or the money or the vindication. The best part was watching my family's reaction to my transformation. The first interview I gave was to a major news network, a primetime special about how I'd uncovered the truth about Marcus Chen. I wore a beautiful designer dress that cost more than I used to make in 3 months, my hair and makeup done by professionals who usually worked with Hollywood stars. The interviewer asked me about my family's reaction to my rejection of Marcus's proposal, and I'd told the truth, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. They disowned me, I said simply. When I rejected Marcus Chen's proposal, my family told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My stepmother said I was ungrateful and stupid. My stepsister laughed at me for thinking I was too good for a billionaire. My father kicked me out of the house and told me I was no longer welcome in the family. The interviewer's eyes had widened with genuine shock. How did that make you feel? At the time, it was devastating. But now I realize it was the best thing that could have happened to me. If my family had been supportive, if they'd respected my decision even when they didn't understand it, I might not have felt compelled to investigate Marcus as thoroughly as I did. Their rejection forced me to rely on my own judgment, and that judgment saved not just my life, but the lives of dozens of other women. The interview aired on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning, my phone was buzzing with calls from reporters who wanted to interview my family about their role in the story. I didn't answer any of them, but I did check social media to see how my family was handling their newfound notoriety. Vivian had posted a long statement on Instagram claiming that the family had always supported Elena's independence and admired her strength. She called me an inspiration to women everywhere and said she was proud to be associated with such a brave and intelligent person. Patricia had been more careful, simply posting a brief statement saying that family matters should remain private and that she wouldn't be commenting on personal situations in the media. But my father had made the mistake of speaking to a reporter outside his office building, and his comments had been even more damaging than I could have hoped. Look, Elena was always a difficult child, he'd said, apparently not realizing he was being recorded. She was stubborn, ungrateful, never satisfied with what she had. When she rejected Marcus's proposal, we thought she was just being dramatic, trying to get attention. How were we supposed to know she was right? The man fooled everyone, including federal investigators, for years. The video had gone viral within hours, with social media users expressing outrage at a father who'd called his daughter difficult for rejecting an abuser. The hashtag #difficultdaughter was trending, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of being dismissed and criticized by family members who didn't support their choices. By Thursday, my family had gone into hiding. Their house was surrounded by reporters and protesters holding signs that read, Believe Women, and Trust Your Daughters. Vivian's modeling career was over before it had really begun. No agency wanted to represent someone whose family had publicly humiliated a woman who'd helped bring down a criminal empire. Patricia's social standing was demolished overnight. The wives who'd once competed for her attention were now cutting ties as quickly as possible, afraid that association with someone who'd been so publicly wrong about Marcus Chen would damage their own reputations. My father's business was hemorrhaging clients and partners who wanted nothing to do with someone who'd called his own daughter difficult for rejecting a man who was now serving multiple life sentences in the federal prison. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. In trying to distance themselves from me, to paint me as the problem in their family, they'd actually made their own judgment look even worse. They'd humiliated themselves more thoroughly than I ever could have, but I wasn't done yet. The book deal I'd signed was worth 7 figures, and the movie rights had sold for even more. I was being invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events about trusting your instincts and standing up to powerful men. I'd become the poster child for women who refused to be silenced or intimidated. And with my newfound platform, I started talking about more than just Marcus Chen. I started talking about family abuse, about the way women are conditioned to be grateful for scraps of affection, about the damage that comes from parents who treat their children like accessories to their own success, rather than individuals with their own worth and dignity. I never mentioned my family by name, but I didn't need to. Everyone knew who I was talking about. The interviews where I described growing up in a house where I was treated like a burden, where my dreams were dismissed and my judgment was constantly questioned, where I was told I should be grateful for any man who showed interest, regardless of how he treated me. The public's reaction was swift and brutal. My family went from being pitied as the relatives of a woman who'd gotten lucky to being seen as abusers who'd nearly delivered their own daughter to a monster. The final piece of my revenge came 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, when I used some of my book advance money to buy the house next door to my family's mansion. The same neighborhood where I'd grown up feeling like an outsider, where I'd been told I didn't belong, where Patricia had made it clear that I was an embarrassment to their social standing. I renovated it beautifully, hiring the same interior designer who'd done the governor's mansion. I hosted charity events for organizations that supported survivors of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. I made sure that every time my family looked out their windows, they could see the home of the woman they'd thrown away, the woman who'd become more successful, more respected, and more beloved than they'd ever dreamed of being. The best part was the garden parties I threw every month, where I invited journalists, prosecutors, federal agents, and other women who'd survived abuse. We'd sit on my terrace, which had a perfect view of my family's house, and talk about the importance of trusting yourself even when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong. Sometimes I'd see Patricia watching from her bedroom window, her face tight with the kind of rage and regret that comes from understanding exactly how badly you've misjudged a situation. Sometimes I'd catch Vivian driving past slowly, staring at the house that represented everything she'd lost when she'd chosen to mock me instead of support me. My father never looked. I think he was too ashamed. But I wasn't done with them yet. Because in my first life, their abuse hadn't ended when Marcus destroyed me. They'd continued to blame me, continued to make me feel like my suffering was somehow my own fault. Even when I was homeless and broken, they'd treated me like a shameful secret rather than a daughter who needed help. This time, I was going to make sure they understood the full consequences of their choices. And I was going to do it in the most public way possible. 6 months later, I published a second book. This one was called Difficult Daughters: How Family Abuse Creates Victims for Predators. It detailed the psychological patterns that make some women vulnerable to exploitation, using my own story as a case study in how family dysfunction can set someone up to accept treatment they should never have to endure. I didn't use their real names, but I didn't need to. Everyone knew this was the continuation of my story, the deeper examination of how I'd ended up in Marcus Chen's crosshairs in the first place. The book became an even bigger bestseller than the first one. It sparked a national conversation about emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and the way families sometimes sacrifice their most vulnerable members to protect their own interests. And it contained one final revelation that I'd saved for last. In the epilogue, I wrote about forgiveness. about how healing requires not just justice for the perpetrators, but understanding for the people who'd failed to protect you. I wrote about reaching out to my family after Marcus's conviction, hoping that seeing the truth about his character would help them understand why I'd made the choice I'd made. I wrote about the phone calls where they'd tried to reconcile with me, not out of love or concern for my well-being, but because they needed to manage their own public image in the aftermath of the scandal. And I wrote about the choice I'd made to walk away from them permanently, not out of spite or anger, but out of self-preservation and dignity. Some people, I wrote in the final paragraph, spend their whole lives trying to earn love from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. The greatest gift I ever gave myself was learning to stop trying. The family that matters isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you choose, the one that sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself. The book tour for Difficult Daughters took me to 30 cities over 3 months. At every stop, the question and answer sessions were packed with women sharing their own stories of family members who'd dismissed their judgment, who'd prioritized image over their safety, who'd blamed them for the abuse they'd suffered. But the most satisfying moment came at the very end of the tour, at a bookstore in my own city. I was signing books and talking to readers when I looked up and saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Marcus Chen's mother, Mrs. Chen. She looked 20 years older than she had at the trial, her face gaunt and her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her diminished frame. She approached my table slowly, a copy of my book clutched in her hands. "Miss Rivera," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "I wanted to thank you." I looked up at her surprised. "Thank me? For stopping my son before he destroyed more lives? For having the courage to speak truth when everyone around you was telling you to stay quiet?" She placed the book on the table for me to sign, and I could see that her hands were shaking. I failed him as a mother. I knew he was troubled. I knew he was hurting people. But I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to stop him. I chose protecting our family's reputation over protecting his victims. She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "Reading your book helped me understand what I should have done differently. It's too late for me to make amends to the women he hurt, but I want you to know that your story matters. Your courage matters." I signed her book with a simple message. For Mrs. Chen, may we all find the strength to choose truth over comfort. Best wishes, Elena. As she walked away, I realized that this was what justice actually looked like. Not just punishment for the perpetrators, but understanding for everyone involved, recognition of the harm that had been done, and commitment to doing better in the future. My family never came to any of my book signings. They never reached out to apologize or try to make amends. As far as I know, they still live in that mansion, surrounded by the ruins of the life they'd built on appearances and status rather than love and integrity. But I don't think about them very often anymore. I'm too busy living the life I'd always dreamed of, but never thought I deserved. The life I'd earned by trusting my own judgment, even when everyone around me was telling me I was wrong. The life that started with a single word: no. 5 years after Marcus Chen's conviction, I stood on the terrace of my penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. The view was spectacular, better than anything I could have imagined in my first life, when I'd been living in that basement room and dreaming of something better. Below me, the city sparkled in the evening light. I could see the building where Marcus's corporate headquarters used to be, now converted into affordable housing for single mothers. I could see the courthouse where justice had finally been served. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible, was the neighborhood where my family still lived, smaller and quieter than they'd once been. My phone buzzed with a text from my publisher. "Elena, the documentary about your story just won the Emmy for Outstanding Investigative Documentary." "Congratulations, you've officially changed the world." I smiled, setting the phone aside. The documentary had been someone else's idea, but I'd cooperated fully with the production. It had aired 6 months ago and sparked yet another national conversation about believing women, about the importance of trusting your instincts, about the way predators use charm and wealth to hide their true nature. More importantly, it had led to legislative changes. The Chen Act required law enforcement agencies to take reports of financial and emotional abuse as seriously as physical violence. Dating apps now had to implement better screening procedures. Universities were required to provide education about manipulation and coercive control. Marcus Chen's legacy wasn't just his own destruction, it was a systemic change that would protect women for generations to come. But the most satisfying part of my new life wasn't the fame or the money or even the legislative victories. It was the phone calls I got from women who'd read my books, who'd heard my story, who'd found the courage to trust their own judgment instead of accepting treatment they didn't deserve. Last week, a 22-year-old college student had called to tell me she'd broken up with her boyfriend after reading Difficult Daughters. He'd been isolating her from her friends, controlling her finances, taking photos without her consent. All the early warning signs I'd learned to recognize. She'd caught it early, before he could do real damage, because my story had taught her what to look for. "I kept thinking about what you wrote," she'd told me, her voice strong and clear. "About how love shouldn't make you smaller. About how the right person will celebrate your independence, not try to control it." When I realized he was trying to make me smaller, I knew it wasn't love. Those phone calls were worth more than all the awards and recognition combined. Every woman who avoided the trap I'd fallen into, every family that learned to support their daughter's choices, even when they didn't understand them, every predator who was exposed before he could cause irreparable harm, all of it justified the pain of my first life. I'd turned my tragedy into purpose, my trauma into triumph. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I checked the security camera, I saw a delivery person with a large floral arrangement. The flowers were beautiful, white lilies and roses in an elegant crystal vase. The card was signed simply, "Thank you for saving my life. A grateful reader." I get flowers like these at least once a week now, from women whose stories mirror my own. Women who recognized the warning signs because I'd shared mine. Women who trusted their judgment because I'd shown them what could happen when you don't. As I arranged the flowers in my living room, I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who'd been so desperate for love and approval that she'd accepted crumbs and called them a feast. The one who'd second-guessed every instinct, who'd apologized for taking up space, who'd believed that she deserved whatever treatment she received. That girl had died in a hospital bed, alone and full of regret. But somehow, she'd been given a second chance. A chance to rewrite her story, to choose courage over compliance, to save herself and countless others in the process. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family had been right about one thing. Rejecting Marcus Chen had changed everything, just not in the way they'd predicted. They'd thought I was throwing away my only chance at happiness and security. They'd seen his wealth and status and assumed that was all that mattered. They'd been so focused on what I might lose that they couldn't see what I might gain, but I'd gained everything. Self-respect, financial independence, a career that mattered, and the knowledge that I'd prevented dozens of other women from suffering the way I had in my first life. Most importantly, I'd gained the understanding that my worth wasn't determined by other people's approval, that my judgment was valid even when everyone around me disagreed with it. That saying no to the wrong person was infinitely more powerful than saying yes, just to avoid conflict. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but that wasn't unusual anymore. Since my story had become public, I got calls from reporters, readers, and other survivors almost daily. "Elena Rivera speaking," I answered. "Elena, this is Detective Martinez. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Detective. How can I help you?" "Actually, I'm calling to help you. We just arrested another predator, someone who was using Marcus Chen's old methods to target vulnerable women. When we searched his apartment, we found copies of your books with sections highlighted in what appears to be a manual for how to avoid detection." My blood ran cold. He was using my books to improve his tactics? "No," Detective Martinez said quickly. "He was using them to understand what we knew about his type of operation. But it backfired spectacularly. Your books were so detailed about the psychology and methodology of predators like Chen that when we compared his behavior to your descriptions, it was like having a roadmap to his crimes." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So my story actually helped you catch him?" "It helped us catch him faster than we would have otherwise. Your work isn't just helping women avoid predators, Elena. It's helping law enforcement identify and prosecute them more effectively. After we hung up, I walked back out to my terrace and looked out over the city again. Somewhere out there, another woman had been saved because I'd found the courage to tell the truth about what had happened to me. In my first life, I died believing that my suffering had been meaningless, that I'd wasted my potential and failed to make any difference in the world. But in this life, I'd learned that our pain only becomes meaningless if we let it. If we hide from it, minimize it, or pretend it didn't happen. When we shine a light on our darkest experiences, when we use them to help others avoid the same traps, when we transform our trauma into wisdom, that's when healing becomes not just personal, but transformational. I thought about my family one more time, living just a few miles away in their diminished world. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction or anger, but genuine pity. They'd spent so much time focused on appearances, on status, on what other people thought of them, that they'd never learned who they actually were underneath all the performance. When the external validation disappeared, they'd had nothing left. But I'd learned that real strength comes from knowing yourself so well that other people's opinions become irrelevant. Real security comes from building a life based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. Real love comes from people who see your authentic self and choose to stay, not from people who only value you for what you can do for them. As I prepared for bed that night, I did something I'd started doing every evening since my story became public. I read one email from my fan mail folder, choosing randomly from the hundreds I received each week. Tonight's email was from a 16-year-old girl whose parents were pressuring her to date a boy from a wealthy family, despite her discomfort with his possessive behavior. She'd read my story and realized that her instincts were valid, that she didn't owe anyone her romantic attention regardless of what her parents thought would be good for the family. "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to be grateful for treatment that makes me feel small," she wrote. "Thank you for proving that sometimes the best thing you can do is trust yourself, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong." I smiled as I closed my laptop. Tomorrow, I would speak at another conference, sign more books, take more calls from survivors who were rebuilding their lives. I would continue the work that had grown out of the worst experience of my first life and become the greatest purpose of my second. But tonight, I would sleep peacefully in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by the life I'd built with my own hands and my own choices. The girl who'd once begged for scraps of affection from people who couldn't see her worth was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and who would never again accept anything less than she deserved. And it had all started with a single word, spoken with quiet confidence to a man who'd expected gratitude and compliance. No. The most powerful word in any language when you finally find the courage to mean it.